this is the loom for the lecture that we had today about African protest and repression. And I'm hoping that this goes a little smoother than my lecture today in class. It's one of the reasons why I don't record lectures any longer is because I rather field questions and see questions. So the looms are kind of just me, myself, and I kind of talking. So again, I hope these are helpful. But we're looking at the African protest and repression. The years that we're going to focus on today are going to be 1949 to the beginning of 1960. We are going to go up to the eve of Sharpeville, but we're not going to talk about Sharpeville at all. That's going to be a unique lecture. That's one of my favorite lectures of this unit to really kind of delve into that. But again, we'll see that a little bit later. But with that, let's talk about this. We're going to talk about a timeline of nonviolence, brutal government oppression, and a shift ultimately to violence. And that's going to be we're going to be the precipice of that. We're not going to be quite finished with this lecture with that, but let's go and get started. I do love the photograph behind. That photograph that is such a great header. It really gives you the element of African protest. Africa for Africans. That's going to be that's interesting. That's going to be a little bit of a radical statement. But look at the other things that are there. We see frustration, anger. See a little bit of smiles, maybe a little bit of joy that they're standing up. Freedom in our lifetime. And that's going to be what we're looking at. And we're going to be looking through the lens of the ANC primarily. The African National Congress, again, you've seen how this kind of book is kind of, the way it's organized. But the ANC, originally they attempted to negotiate with government. This dates back to like 1911, 1912. And again, you need to make sure you understand the ANC, when it formed, it was the bourgeois organization. Because remember, prior to the Boer War, class distinction trumped race. You remember that, I hope. But at the outcome of the Boer War, with the formation of the Republic of the Union of South Africa, we began to see the transition to race-based. And that you have a couple bourgeois Africans that live in Cape Town who now begin to see their lost privilege. And the ANC originally forms in hopes that they can negotiate the privilege back. It is not a national black movement. And some of these bourgeois Africans, they look down upon the rural. So there's going to be a schism, if you will, a chasm between them. And ultimately, they're going to have to overcome that. By the time of the late 1930s, you get this Congress Youth League going into the 1940s. In the 1940s, the Congress Youth League that was drastically impacted by both the World War II, the mine strike, and the election of 1948, leaders such as Nelson Mandela began to put pressure on the ANC. And again, if we wanted to compare this to American civil rights, I do think you can look at the CYL as similar to SNCC. I hope you see that comparison. But the Congress Youth League, led by Mandela, they're really going to begin to put pressure on the ANC to take more drastic action. The ANC didn't want to do that. They were worried that whatever privilege they had would be lost. So there's this kind of a fear of what's happening. But in 1949, the Congress Youth League did get the ANC to enact the Program of Action. The Program of Action is going to be, they're going to organize, it's going to be about organization of disobedience, civil disobedience, strikes, boycotts, etc. And ultimately, what this is doing is forcing the ANC to rethink their position as the African National Congress. And the idea of the CYL was to make the African National Congress actually a national movement for Africans. And the first moment of this is the 1950 May Day strike, the May Day sit-in or stay at home. This is an important moment because this was the first national moment, a single day, not a massive event, but a single day that that was the African attempt to tell the South African government that they were economically important. I do want to point out, May Day is a communist holiday, so that is one of the issues. Second thing is the SACP seems to have worked with them. This was the worst possible thing that could occur because I don't think the ANC understood the context of the Cold War necessarily. And what's the result? The Suppression of Communism Act. Check that out. Look at the time. Look at the way that this caused an effect. And what this national government is able to do is turn the the African rights movement into a communist movement. And look to the right. I love this photograph, this image, this political cartoon. We can juxtapose this maybe to the one from the militant that we looked at. Where the one in the militant, the African was angry, ripping up, powerful. There was nothing that the white clan member or a government could do. I do believe this guardian one is very different. The tone, even though the whites are smaller, they only make up 20% of the population. They have new things such as police raids, pass laws, and other laws that were going to hold them back. And the question is, he's waking up, little man, what now? I think the what now is going to be more repressive government. I do think the differences in the nature of the two countries are indicated in these two political cartoons. But with that said, let's move on. So as the Defiance campaign, as the program of action is really kind of indicating this national movement, in 1952, we see the first mass movement. We see a large-scale protest against unjust laws. I typically focus on past laws, but absolutely, somebody pointed out there was a cattle law here. And that cattle law really identifies that the nature of the ANC is attempting to be changed, that this is not a bourgeois urban league, but something about the whole country of South Africa. And the way they're going to protest is they're going to use civil disobedience. And when they get arrested, they refuse to pay bail. No bail. They basically chanted, no bail, go to jail. And the thing is that their goal was to overwhelm the penal system, the penitentiary system, the jails. And they were hoping that it would drain resources that ultimately would force change. They had a series of bus boycotts, not quite the big one that's going to be 1957, but they did organize small-scale bus stops. And as we step out of the Defiance campaign, I do want to point out Albert Lutuli becomes the president of the ANC during this time period. He is the first. He was of Zulu descent. The fun fact, he was actually a Zulu chief that he had to surrender that to become president of the ANC. And Albert Lutuli fully, outwardly supported the Defiance campaign. This changes. This is evidence that the nature of the ANC had begun to change. Rather than being bougie and negotiating for their own privilege, Albert Lutuli was officially saying that they represent Africa, the Africans, and they're going to reach out across social distinctions and make this a singular movement. Now, let's look at the results of the Defiance campaign. And when we weigh this, was it successful or not? And before I get done with any of the details, I want to point out my thesis is, despite any element or an illusion of success, the South African government reaction proved to crush the Defiance campaign. I would argue by 1953, there's less progress. They were in a worse position than they were prior to the Defiance campaign. All of the fear of the ANC that if they began to outwardly protest, they would be in a worse position. It comes to fruition with this. So let's go look around. Number one, 8,000 arrests. That's what they wanted. Excellent, right? They got arrests. Well, what do? Government fails to capitulate. They're not going to withdraw one of those laws, and instead they expand penal infrastructure. They build more jails. It's the idea that, hey, if you Africans want to break laws, we got more result, more profits from the gold and diamond ones, and we're going to build more prisons. This was kind of a shock for the African leaders. Like, what just happened? Well, let's see, another success. They go from 7,000 members to 100,000. This is a success. High five. We're excited. Unfortunately, the reaction is the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1953. And again, you see, I identify it's an arbitrary law, but the problem is once it becomes law, it becomes less arbitrary. It's codified. But the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1953 said anyone who is associated with a guilty person will be presumed guilty. So if you have 100,000 people guilty of the Defiance campaign, what about their families? What about their friends? That 100,000 now is exponentially more. And this was created to rebuff and stop all the movements, to create chaos within the Africans. Such a huge aspect. I do believe that the Freedom Charter is evidence of the failure of the Defiance Campaign. Because at the outcome, Albert Lutuli began to realize, holy crud, instead of a unified movement, every failure we have creates more fractures. So he wants to end that. And the number one group that he was worried about was the Africanists. The Africanists had began to move and said, white men, Indian men, colored men, they're never going to represent the African men. So they wanted to create an Africa for Africans only. This would create some chaos. And Albert Lutuli realized there was no way for them to do this. So now what do? Well, they organize the Congress of the People. It is a mass meeting of the ANC leaders, SAIC leaders, the Colored National Congress leaders, the SACP leaders. And now the whole point was to create an ideological foundation in which all members could agree with. So if all members can't agree with it, they're going to leave it out. They're not going to create chaos. They want to create unity. This is why the Freedom Charter comes out of this. And it's charterism or chartism. The idea that we're going to have a singular document that has all of our principles. And if you want to be part of our organization or our protest movement, you must agree with every single one. Well, not shockingly, the first one we see is a non-racial South Africa. A non-racial South Africa was, we're not going to see it through a racial lens. We're going to get rid of apartheid and we're going to become one South Africa. This was a dig on the Africanists. This was like, hey, if you want to be part of a larger movement, you must agree to surrender this part of who you are. We're going to find out a little bit later that's not going to work out well for the ANC. They're going to focus on human rights, the human rights. Read the document, guys. Huge document. When I say not geographically, not number-wise, but it's an important document. Talks about individual rights, about gender, sexuality, these things that were so much more foreseen than we were in America. But they also talk about redistribution of wealth, because they realized the number one thing that impeded the development of Africans was the lack of land. So it was about the redistribution of land. The only way people can have a chance at advancement is if they had access to land. Now, a little side note, my historical bias, I will tell you, I do see the world through a capitalist world lens, but I also see it in this way. The only way Africa could advance, and South Africa can advance even today, is if they create land reform. So again, even though I'm a capitalist, see the world capitalist, I totally see and understand the reason for this redistribution of land. If you want to have a parlay with me to find out more about how I see that, I would love to chit chat with you guys another day. Now, if you've read the document, which I pray you have, you would have known it was a ginormous document in the sense that, not again size-wise, but the scope of it. It has so much in it that every piece that could somewhat be agreed upon was put in. It's this huge quilt, if you will, of revolutionary ideals, anti-apartheid ideals, communist ideals, socialist ideals, liberal ideals. And the whole point was to construct this. And on June 26th, they unfold this in 1955. And unfortunately, the police swarm in and arrest them. The meeting is now canceled, arrested, if you will, closed. And this was closed. I do believe the police from what I understand, the police had insight of what was going on, and they knew the perfect time. Because now they have evidence of treason. They have evidence with this document that these people meant to unwind the republic. But the organization never created a process or plan to carry it out. So the document itself is empty. It doesn't unite anything, and it's going to be used as evidence in something called the treason riot, the trial, and we'll see that. Now, as this is kind of unfolding, I do want to point out the bus boycotts. This is a famous painting, a photograph, excuse me. And again, we see messages being, you can derive from this. Africans are cooperating independent of the buses. I think the buses are empty. If you look at it, the buses are quite empty. So the message being conveyed there is the cooperation of Africans were able to surpass this, remove, impact the buses, and the buses were empty. So therefore, they were on the verge of bankruptcy. Now, there's a series of them, but the Alexander bus boycott's the most important. And I don't want to totally spend 1,000 minutes here, but think about this. It was mass organization because there is about the fare rate. This is a protest against the Natives Resettlement Act. The Native Resettlement Act forced all Africans out of Johannesburg and other urban areas. They were forced to live in townships that were miles and miles away from their work. Well, buses became more strapped. They were overextended. So they decided they needed to raise fares. Well, since they're driving and transporting Africans, then the Africans themselves should be the ones paying for it. That's why you had that 25% increase in wages. It went from 4 pences to 5 pences. It seems good, seems fair, but the Africans were like, what in the HE double hockey sticks are you doing? You're forcing us out of our homes. You're forcing us away from our wealth. We have lost everything. And now because you forced us there, you're now going to make us pay more to get to the work to serve you. This is the root of the bus boycott. And I do believe the South African government, they're forced to capitulate because they were the cause of it. I think the other things that we can look at, the other forms of protest, the Freedom Charter, the Defiance Campaign, the May Day strike, all of those can be identified as communist. This bus boycott shone a light on the evils of the Native Resettlement Act. So instead of facing their evil, they forced the companies to reduce their fares. So it is an outlier. I asked this arbitrary question, is it an outlier? Duh! It's an outlier because it's the only thing that the South African government could never truly justify. So this is the only sense of success in this wave of apartheid. And I can even argue it's only temporarily. But the result of this, guys, is the treason trial. From 1956 to 1961, at the outcome of the Defiance Campaign, the outcome of the Freedom Charter, the People's Congress, the outcome of the outcome of even the bus boycotts. From 1956 to 1961, the government's going to react to all of this, and they're going to put in prison 156 leaders. In December 1956, they're going to treason trial. The evidence is going to be the Freedom Charter, that they were going to have a revolution. Now, if you go back to the Freedom Charter, there's nothing revolutionary about that. There's not saying about any violence. So it is true that the South African government overplayed its hand. They do not have the evidence to prove high treason, which is the only punishment is execution. But that's where we see it. And despite the lack of credible evidence, this trial is going to drag on for over 4 years into the 5th year. Starts in December, ends in early 61, so it's more like 4 years, 1 month or so. But despite the credible evidence, the trial drags on. And this is where I think your textbook and I disagree. I think your textbook kind of concludes, if I'm right, that this is a positive moment that created unity. I don't think that's true. And it's not just because it's my opinion, it's my thought, my historical understanding. Because what happened is all of the ANC resources that were being used to help coordinate events now had to be halted and to pay for the defense. The leaders were either in prison or under house arrest. So therefore, the leadership is being robbed. They cannot lead. The whole point of the treason trial maybe is not to execute the leaders, but to halt them, to control them, to dominate them. So that the South African government can create more laws, which go back to your notes, go back to your parallels. We see a series of laws. Again, in 1959, what do we have? Think about the act, about the Bantustans system, the Self-Government Act. This is where we're heading, guys, because the South African government wanted to halt. So therefore, where your book sees its unity, I see it as an ending. It reduces the resources. And what's going to happen? Well, in 1959 and 1960, there's going to be a division within the anti-apartheid movement. And this division is going to be manipulated by the national government. By 1959, you have the formation of PAC, the Pan-African Congress. Robert Sobukwe says, we are Africans. Africa for Africans, Africanistic. The idea that these guys were frustrated. They have kind of put away their differences after the Freedom Charter. They had hoped to create momentum. But in 1959, enough's enough. The ANC in itself became divided. Albert Luthuli wanted to continue the traditional practice of nonviolence. And Nelson Mandela says, wait a minute, this has achieved nothing. By 1959, nothing has been achieved. Think about it. Check it off. Bus boycott, cute. But everything else is about submission and the entrenchment of apartheid. And the government has heightened its attack on the protest movement. And this is exactly what they had hoped. I think the treason trial was part of it. Even though some of those guys knew they were never going to be able to find these guys guilty, they knew it would put pressure and create cracks. And that's where we are in 1960. On the eve of Sharpeville, there's division, blindness, directionless. And the South African government benefits from that. I hope that makes sense to you guys. I hope that this lecture was a little bit more focused